Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. I've been working as a journalist for over a decade, and before that I was an NGO worker and a student in several different countries. In all of them, left-wing movements, activists, including Marxist groups, were present in different shapes and forms. I met them regularly during protests, conferences, and they were part of my social circles. This is not the case in Central Asia. When I moved to Tashkent in 2018, I wondered where the radical youth is today and why they are not visible. Not as registered groups, of course, because we all know how strictly controlled politics in places like Uzbekistan is, but as informal, semi-underground gatherings. I wondered, does Central Asia not need left-wing politics? To talk about Marxism and the left in Central Asia, I am joined by Georgy Mamedov, an independent curator, writer, and activist originally from Dushanbe. His work focuses on critical reinterpretation of Soviet socialism in Central Asia and the broader post-Soviet space. Georgy co-authored and co-edited several books, including a book on happiness for young and not so LGBT and not only people, Queer Communism is Ethics, Concepts of the Soviet in Central Asia, and Bishkek Utopian. Until recently, Georgy served as an assistant professor of film and media arts at the American University of Central Asia in Bishkek. In 2025, he joined the University of Melbourne's research initiative of post-Soviet space as a graduate scholar. In this role, he is working on the research project titled Towards a Communist Ideal, Marxism and Marxists under Soviet Socialism. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Georgy. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello.
So, I've been working in different regions across the years, and what I've noticed is that in the majority of places where I worked, there were always some Marxist or left-wing movements, mostly youth movements. But this is something that I was missing in Central Asia. And obviously there might be different reasons for that. But I would like to start by asking you, how did you come to left-wing politics?
Well, my short answer, I think that, and I guess it's very typical, one becomes Marxist under the pressures of capitalism. I think that's more or less a generic experience, including Marx himself. But of course, my sort of personal journey, so to speak, becoming Marxist, it's also kind of biographical. Maybe I should say a few words. So I was born in 1984 in Dushanbe in Soviet Tajikistan, so a year before Perestroika. So when I went to school, so when I was 7 in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And in the case of Tajikistan, so the general sort of misery of the 90s, the overall disintegration of social fabric was severed by the civil war that started in 1992. I don't think that I need to give any specific details what kind of life it was. I mean, it's kind of, shared by the entire post.
No, please do. I think it's very important. How did you feel as a child growing up in the 90s?
Well, of course, I was a child, but it's impossible to not notice what is happening to you, what is happening to your parents who are struggling for survival. But I think the main sort of characteristic of that period is poverty. Both individual poverty that you struggle in your family, which of course could vary between different people and different social strata, etc. But overall, it was a general condition and a general sort of infrastructural poverty that surrounds you, or maybe even in the case of Tajikistan with the civil war, destitute, no water, no gas, no electricity, no public transport, no access to basic goods, etc. at certain periods, and then the background of the war. But one specific thing was in that situation, as I said, that it was shared. Like I was poor, all my friends were poor. Everyone I knew somehow in a different capacities, my senior colleagues, my teachers, etc. We were all somehow going through the same situation. As I said, not in equal measure, of course, but overall. And then in 2009, I moved to Moscow for a couple of years to do my studies. And it is in Moscow when I just realized that I wasn't just poor as a kind of a descriptor. I also was not rich. And that the wealth at the same time existed around me. And that wealth was something that not only just existed parallel to me, but I started understanding that it confronts me. So, in other words, it's not just the experience of poverty or destitution, disenfranchisement that the 90s brought to so many people, but it's also a later experience of class antagonism, if I use pure Marxist language, which was very, very embodied. It's like I passed by, shops that I knew I would never be able to buy anything in. I passed by houses where I knew I would never be able to step my foot in. I passed by restaurants and cafes that I knew that were not only just outside of my pay bracket, it was like unattainable for me even to imagine myself socializing there. There was this huge gap. So that experience, and it's not that I did not, leave Tajikistan before, I did not, travel. I was well traveled by that time as well. But the experience of living in Moscow was prolonged in a way. So
it's also a very, very unequal society, right?
It is a very unequal society.
Unequal.
It's extremely, where you can see these, extremes. And especially that was 2009, that Moscow was a specifically bad place in that respect. So I think that had two effects on me. One was, of course, it politicized me towards the left and in some sort of anti-capitalist statement. But that's one thing. The other thing, it made me curious. It made me curious to understand, okay, how this works, why this exists, how it's being produced, why do I occupy that specific position in that structure of the society? And, I thought, well, where should I look for answers? I heard Marx wrote Capital, and I heard that Marxism was a theory of capitalism. So why don't I look there? So this is how I became Marxist. Yeah, not just leftist, not just someone who understood my sort of class position within the structure, but also made me curious to understand what it means, what sort of effects it has on my life. Why it took me 25 years, because that happened around when I was 25, to understand that. Because I wasn't Marxist before, I wasn't anti-capitalist, maybe seriously before. I did not even maybe engage so much with those questions. So that brought me to Marxism. So the experience class consciousness, if I can put it like that, because it's not, again, I want to stress, it's not only the experience of deprivation and poverty, it's also understanding that this condition cannot be overcome. Of course, I'm not as poor as I was in the 90s, but I'm also not rich. My class position did not change. My income changed. My sense of human dignity, maybe over the course of time, changed, but my class position did not change. I still have to sell my labor to survive, and that will never change under my lifespan. I will always be selling my labor to survive. I feel, in general, that Marxism gave me an adequate framework to understand my own condition and the condition that I share with other people. So this is the answer. And when I moved to Central Asia back in 2011, I think 2011. I kept thinking about that, and I did realize that and it's changing now. Yeah, but back then the wealth or income inequality in Central Asia is very high. That's true. But the public presence of wealth was not as articulated in Central Asia, like in early 2000s and even in 2010s, as much as it is becoming more and more present, of course, with the difference between countries. Yeah. So that, I think, one reason to answer to your question, that's what we thought, I and my comrades thought back, why there is no this leftist politicization, which very often starts within, educated middle classes, urban young people before it becomes a, more popular movement. It's just the position of a middle class employer, middle class intellectual does not set that sort of unimaginable attainment of wealth within the country. Like, yes, there are places I would not go in Bishkek that are beyond my paycheck, but they're not popping up in my eyes every time I get out of the street, yeah? So sort of the horizon of consumption, of possible consumption in Central Asia, due to its sort of economic underdevelopment and the class antagonisms, were as pronounced in 2000s and 2010s. Yeah, that's changing now. We do see that sharpening of class antagonisms coming to Central Asia.
That's what I wanted to address next, because I spent 3 years in Uzbekistan and I literally saw the country develop in front of my eyes, like with a rapid speed. And what I noticed also when I was teaching at university was that my students were so interested in like pursuing wealth that they didn't really see anything wrong with inequality. It was very strange to me, because many of those people were born in poor families, like outside of Tashkent, outside of a big city with few opportunities, really. But what they really wanted was the Dubai-style wealth. And to me, it seemed that they assumed that if you are successful, then you're somehow better. Then it's somehow you don't, because you succeeded, you don't really have to care about the other people, because the other people are losers, because they could have also succeeded, right? So I wonder, how do you see the situation right now, and how is the Central Asian society changing?
Let's look at this situation like that, this pursuit of success, yeah? What does it actually indicate? So I will put it like that in a little bit paradoxical way. So first, as a Marxist, actually, I would say people are not stupid. So there is no such an assumption in if you look at things from a Marxist perspective, that people are stupid and that people are brainwashed. That's not really something that we can take seriously as Marxists. People know what capitalism has for them. So in some way, this sort of very selfish, or this drive to success, it's exactly a desire to avert, to buffer the negative effects of capitalism on an individual. Yeah. So that's a very intuitive understanding that is present among people. If we look from this perspective, we would not say there is no anti-capitalist sentiment or intuitive anti-capitalist sentiment in any way in the world, including Central Asia. In the 19th century, when Marx wrote Capital, he actually, this is how he analyzes this drive towards colonization, that, the workers who felt that that's their destiny, to be constantly reproduced as a worker in Britain, that's what motivated a lot of them to pursue something that then would become called an American dream. In a kind of paradoxical way, yeah? Sort of escaping the brutality of capitalism by hoping to attain some higher status, with the desire to attain private property of any sort, and to become an exploiter in some way of someone else. We can look at this sort of radical drive to be on the top of others under capitalism as an intuitive, yes, not coming from intuition, but not a theoretical analysis, resistance to capitalism. And it is not entirely unmotivated, because capitalist world, or global capitalism, is unevenly developing. So there are always pockets in different places that create this illusion that changing your location, that some sort of mobility can improve your experience of capitalism. This is the driver of migration even today. That's why we see that, millions of people leaving Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan or even Uzbekistan, in pursuit of better jobs and better incomes, kind of as a response to the brutality of capitalism back in home and Central Asia. And then in other places like Western Europe, like in the core, where a lot of people understand that there is no movement, there is no frontier anymore to kind of overcome the pressures. That's where the response becomes more political and self-aware, which also means that the general living conditions of people who are also suffering, still allows them to engage with that condition theoretically, rather than seeking ways to basically save your life by, immigrating, taking a boat ride under the bullets, or subjecting yourself to the ordeal of immigration, even if you have some resources to undertake that enterprise. Because let's be honest, reading Marx today is a privilege. Who has the time to read a book of that size, for example? So this is how I would understand this situation in a more complex terms. But class antagonism in Central Asia will be apparent. The less and less, there is another element of that. There is also there was an element of resilience, of socialist resilience in post-Soviet space, that made capitalism, even in its awful neoliberal shock therapy way bearable. Like, mind one simple thing, how all Soviet citizens, most Soviet citizens, became the owners of apartments in the 90s and did not have to pay rent.
I think that you can always look at this in both ways, right? That one thing is what you're saying now, and the other thing is that because of all the things that happened during the Soviet Union, maybe some people wrongly associate left-wing politics with the problems and the crimes that took place during the Soviet period. So do you think it also kind of influences the fact that the left-wing movements in Central Asia are so few?
Again, I think there are two big things to this. Like, I don't think that that's the case for Central Asia, to be honest. Yeah, I'll back that. Let me say something else. Yeah, it's a serious question. And it's a serious question that, let's say, post-Soviet left, myself included, and notwithstanding how marginal and small it was, yeah. So that was the question that we also sort of grappled with. To be honest, I will tell you straightforwardly. So when I tried to think about this class antagonism, that did not make me immediately interested in the Soviet past. I was interested in Marxism. I was interested in reading Marx, and I was interested in reading Marxist tradition that somehow did not involve Soviet experience at all. That was actually a big debate among Soviet or post-Soviet left in early 2000s, which I think kind of emerged on the background of 2008 financial crisis and its consequences. And what was part of that process too is that there was a generation of people who were not like myself, maybe a little younger, a little older, but those who actually did not experience, did not live under Soviet socialism. Yeah, we lived already in the post-Soviet space. And one solution was kind of I don't want to put labels, but coming maybe more from a Trotskyist kind of tradition that, yes, we have to completely give up the Soviet past. And that's actually a distraction. This is what makes people misunderstand what socialism is. There is a confusion between Soviet socialism and what Marxism or Marxist critique of capitalism. But I give you an example. So when I moved to Bishkek, we started a small but quite sort of steady cultural center that had to bring art, theory, and political practice together, called Shtab. So we started, one of our first programs was Marxism Ligbez, what we call it, or the Marxist education. It did not cause any interest. Like, people were not genuinely interested in Marxism. But people were coming to us and said, okay, so you're a Marxist, what do you think about Soviet Union? Or what do you think about Soviet socialism? And that what sort of made us understand that we cannot avoid this question. That's whether we want it or not. That experience of Marxist politics or Marxist-informed politics that the people have. And moreover, people had questions of this kind. They wanted to understand what that Soviet experience was. So we launched a bigger project that was focused on sort of Marxist understanding, or post-Soviet Marxist understanding of Soviet socialism. And that attracted a lot of public attention. This is what people wanted to actually sort of talk and discuss, and both critically and engaging. And that included people who lived through Soviet socialism, but also included their children, so to speak, yeah, like myself, and younger, who felt that, they needed to deal with that. So that's one thing. It's unavoidable. We have to talk about Soviet socialism. I don't think that the strategy that if you call yourself Marxist, or we talk about socialist politics, you can somehow artificially distance yourself from experience of its real or actual realization, yeah, or really existing socialism.
Okay, so how do you discuss this with people? With people who are, for example, coming to your lectures and, your events that you organized in Bishkek?
Well, the question was very simple. Let's try to understand what it was. First of all, we have to question our existing perception, yeah, with some sort of innovative research that would allow us to understand, yeah. There were a few important ideological twists that had to be done, yeah. So first of all, not to call Soviet socialism a communism, because that's unjustified historically, historiographically. But historically, first of all, Soviet Union never called itself communist. It's never declared that it achieved communism. So that was one thing. The second was to understand the complexity of Soviet experience. And in some way, there is another confusion. Yeah, we say Soviet, we think communist. We say Soviet, we think Russian. Which is absolutely a feature of Anglophone historiographical tradition and political tradition, rather than anything that represents actuality of Soviet experience. Indeed, There's a lot of research on that, and it's how Soviet and Russian are actually in tension to each other. So that's the argument of a lot of Russian nationalists, that the Soviet regime was oppressive to Russian national identity, it suppressed Russian national state. And that's one of the reasons the Soviet Union fell under the pressure of that sort of forces of dissatisfaction of Russians who felt that they were, providing for the entire Soviet Union. That's one thing. Second, Soviet was therefore, as much as it was Russian in its specific component related to Russian Federation, it was also Tajik and Kyrgyz and Kazakh. So there was this entanglement and this diversity that could not be reduced to one common denominator. And it is this sort of diversity, and especially the Soviet experience in Central Asia, both in its typical aspects, but also in a specific aspect. That's what interested us. And that's what I think what also attracted resonance among different audience, academic and non-academic public, because people always felt that the discourse around them somehow reduces them to, this function of, Soviet, you were under Russian influence, you did not have anything to say, or people felt that their experience did not exactly correspond with that, but they also did not know how to talk about that because there was no adequate language to describe that, because the language of the Soviet language of self-description also did not describe it. The friendships of people, equality. The ideological Soviet text did not represent fully people's life, but the anti-Soviet, so to speak, text also did not capture their experience. So that was the whole thing. Okay, how can we construct adequate categories and understanding that cannot be reduced to either of that, Soviet ideological narrative or anti-Soviet ideological narrative?
But at the same time, here in Central Asia now, especially in Kazakhstan, you do have a very strong decolonial movement that is kind of looking at the way local people felt, subjugated to Russia, felt unable to fulfill themselves as, their culture, their language. And I wonder what you think about that. How do you engage with those arguments and those theories? Because the fact that Kazakhs, for example, died in the famine and that the number of people were unable to speak their language, it's a fact. So I wonder, how do you kind of answer questions from these kind of people who are more concerned about the colonial aspect of the Soviet experience, which obviously was there too?
In my own life and in my own family, and in my own experience, let's put it like that. The post-colonial theory allows me to understand a lot of things about myself and my experience, the experience of my family, concerning the language laws, for example, between generations, the experience of immigration, the experience of othering, the experience of everyday racism, and also political events of subjugation of different groups, and even the experience of violence that a lot of people experienced during the Soviet time just because who they were, based on their ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation. So, first of all, I'm not excluded from all this. There is no such thing as you are a Marxist and you speak from a position. All elements of Soviet experience that can be brought, from repressions to displacement to Russification, all this is part of my experience as well as of anyone else. So there is no such thing as that I have to talk to people who had certain experiences, and I speak from the position that I didn't have. I don't know Marxists in Central Asia who wouldn't be entangled in the same Soviet experiences. So there's no conversation between, and this is a big problem with the decolonial thought, that it appeals to some sort of unique experience that these people went through, and they talk to those who did not go through this experience. But that's not the case of Central Asia. And that's not the case of post-Soviet Central Asia. That's a very specificity of Soviet experience, that Soviet people somehow, in different configurations and in a very differentiated way, but we're all subjected to different repressive aspects of the Soviet system, everyone in different configurations, including the one that within different ethnic groups, the beneficiaries of Soviet socialism were also differently sort of distributed. A lot of people who speak from the colonial positions come from the families who were way more entangled within Soviet establishment and were way more prosperous beneficiaries of Soviet socialism than, put it bluntly, than my own family. So there is this aspect which is very important. That is to say that post-colonial sensibility and the colonial theory can tell us a lot about Soviet experience. But I also don't think that we can entirely reduce the Soviet experience to a colonial paradigm. And that's when it becomes interesting. And this is where I think a lot of Marxist work has to be done to explain in a Marxist-informed theory what we were dealing with. And one way to think about that, in a Marxist way, to think of the Soviet Union as a self-denying empire.
Mm-hmm.
And if we think it in that way, so if we use this dialectical concept of self-denial or negation or self-negating empire, this concept of negation, it does involve these moments of preservation and resistance and contradictions. A lot of imperial and colonial tendencies have been preserved within the Soviet project, even if the project itself tried to negate them. And that's the complexity that we have to deal. And I think that post-colonial sensibility can help us deal with that. But we also need a more complex understanding to that. And I think there are two things that I want to say, We have to look at it in two ways, and I want to look at it in two ways. One is a Marxist, because it's not only the question for post-Soviet Marxist or post-Soviet leftist or post-Soviet people. The same question, it could be addressed to anyone who declares themselves Marxist. They could be, and what do you think about Stalinism? Or what do you think about Soviet crimes? How can you call yourself Marxist, etc.? Slightly provocative answer would be, I think there has been a redemption. I think that both Marxist theory and Marxist politics, which is, I think, more important, or the working class politics, has paid the high price for crimes of Stalinism. I don't want to go into history from 1956, but few things have to be mentioned. I give you an example, a very artistic one. That I just learned about this recently, that the last painting that Frida Kahlo painted in the same year when she died, in 1954, was a self-portrait with a portrait of Stalin. So the date here is very interesting, yes? She paints this portrait as a homage to Stalin, who died a year before, right before she would die herself, but before the world sort of became aware of Stalinist crimes, before the denunciation of cult of Stalin. That resulted pretty much in a total disintegration of the Communist International movement, of the communist parties in many places in the world, especially in the West. That's one effect. Second, the entire intellectual driver of 1960s Marxism and Marxist intellectuals was grappling with the question of the interpretation and reflection on Stalinism. Was it a deviation from Marxism? Was it a logical conclusion of Marxism? What are the flaws in Marxist theory that might have led to such a development? And attempts to come up with some accountability for the future, how we think as Marxists so that cannot be repeated. But largely, these attempts, intellectual attempts, failed. That eventually led to marginalization of Marxism as a theory and development of more identity-driven, cultural, sensitive, critical theory that kind of detaches itself from Marxism. So disintegration of the communist movement, marginalization of Marxist theory in the Soviet Union, including the Soviet Union, which is very paradoxically, though Marxism was preserved as this official ideology, the intellectual work related to Marxism was largely marginalized in the Soviet Union itself. And the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union and establishment of, so to speak, unchallenged neoliberal capitalism. So that's the price that the advancement of capitalism in its brutal forms that we are going through is that high price that I think that was paid. That's on the side of Marxism. Now on the side of post-Soviet subjects. Here, I think the situation is a little bit more complicated and a little bit more complex. I don't think the redemption or the reckoning on the side of post-Soviet societies has happened fully. I'll give you an example. Again, so that to understand that. How I myself learned about Stalinist crimes. I learned about them from my grandparents. So my grandfather told me his stepfather was a World War II veteran. He was kind of a high-ranking officer during the war. So he saw in his study a photograph of officers in the front, of a regiment or something, with many faces scratched on that photograph. So my grandfather is a young man. Then says, "Oh, what is going on? Why these faces are scratched?" And his stepfather says, "Oh, these are the enemies of the people. That's not a public photograph. That's a photograph kept at home by someone who was a beneficiary of the Soviet system, but also was somehow a victim of that. He wasn't repressed, but he lost his position, was sent to, whatever. But he at home, in his private photograph, scratches the faces of his comrades with whom he fought in the front. He does that. There is no a commissar who holds a pistol to his head. That shocked my grandfather, who had his entire life was a committed communist, but never a member of a communist party, and never entertained the idea of becoming a member of communist party. When I asked him why you never thought of joining the communist party, he said, because, well, I'm not a corrupt bureaucrat to be part of them. So I'm telling this to show that what we call Soviet crimes and all this legacy, it entangles all Soviet people. Yes, with ethnic differences, class differences, peasantry, workers, intelligentsia are included, but it's also something that engaged all Soviet society. And it's something that calls for a reflection from within Soviet society rather than a simple externalization of that discussion by assuming, oh, that's Russians.
Yeah.
Or that's some abstract Comrade Stalin who did that. No, we were all, or they were all, and as much as in our today's society, we are all entangled in its complex historical process. And it is for us all to face that. So as much as I think that as Marxists of any nationality, of any origin, we don't have to have any guilt about the crimes of Stalinism because we pay the high price for that. But we still have to do the reckoning so that we develop the protocols of accountability, theoretical and political and practical, so that is not repeated. But as post-Soviet, when it comes to post-Soviet societies, I don't think that that reckoning has fully happened. And I think that for Central Asian societies, it is important that this reckoning happens probably with no regard to Russia, to Putin, to what is happening in Russia, but in regard to our own issues, to our own dynamic, which included, of course, Russians and Russia and the Soviet Union, but cannot be just, seen. Because if we assume that during the entire Soviet history, we were just objects of historical process, what makes us think that we are now can be subjects? We need to assume historical subjectivity. And historical subjectivity and any subjectivity always comes with responsibility and accountability. And this is what I think where Marxism drives us to hold this conversation in these terms, in terms of accountability, responsibility, and subjectivity, rather than victimhood.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. So tell me, when we talk about agency of local countries or local people within the Soviet system, what sort of agency we can talk about? Because, we discussed it a little bit before our interview, but I really think this is important to kind of look maybe at some examples.
I think this agency can be seen in multiple layers. Yeah. So one is everything that had been built, created during Soviet time was created by Soviet people of all nationalities. So everything, yeah, roads, schools, buildings, factories, all that was built by Soviet people who lived on these territories. So that's one thing. Yeah, that's the agency. The problem starts within the Soviet Union itself, that not a lot of people felt that it was theirs. And that's where we have to look at. But in reality, it was theirs. Not Stalin who was building apartments for people. It was people themselves. So it was Stalin who went to work and produce things, or lived every single Soviet life. People lived their lives, however difficult they were. So the Soviet was theirs in full capacity, however bad or good it was. Yeah, that's one thing. Second thing, we'd have to really look at the intellectual and political contribution of Central Asian Bolsheviks and Central Asian intellectuals in the process of building socialism and shaping what socialism was, or real socialism, Soviet socialism was in their own countries. And we definitely understand that with all the measure of typicality between cases, it was different. You look, the very interesting experience that I had this year was that I was going to Din Muhammad Kunaev's museum in
I've been there
Almaty,
recently.
which is interestingly,
amazing.
Recently, it's amazing. It's extremely well attended. It's a very popular museum. And I'm not I've never been fond of Soviet establishment or Soviet nomenclatura. Yeah, that these are not the people with whom I would associate Soviet socialism. But he did not live a typical Soviet life as a head of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan. But he also did not live a life that was unattainable for a regular Soviet citizen, if you look at that. And then there is a lot of pride in, this development of Almaty that happened under his rule. And Almaty, again, due to certain circumstances, including the relocation of the capital to Tselenograd or Akmola, becoming Astana, preserved that sort of, even by now, kind of a utopian image of a socialist city with its, public spaces, greenery, infrastructure that is being now totally incorporated into capitalist world, but it's still there. So there is this experience like that. So even looking at politicians such unappealing to some extent, not a revolutionary, but a Soviet bureaucrat like Kunaev can tell us about the agency. Not to mention, for example, a Kyrgyz Bolshevik Jusup Abdurrahmanov, with his sort of engagement and sort of advocacy on Kyrgyz statehood within the Soviet Federation, for example, and the management skills that he exercised in the 1930s, and then falling a victim of Stalinist repressions that were targeted, first and foremost, not exclusively, but mainly towards the Bolsheviks. And the same goes to intellectual contributions, to the revolutionary poetry of Asia. Like on the issue, actually, on the centennial of Lenin's death, we translated into English poems of Jomart Bakambayev, Kyrgyz revolutionary poet, who was definitely speaking from a very conscious class position and tried to find the artistic, poetic means to express his political position in Kyrgyz. But the thing is that these personalities, their lives, their biographies, their intellectual contributions have been ignored for years. Like in the Soviet Union itself, they might have been looked down at, but also in the post-Soviet space. Some of them were reinstated as members of the nationalist canons, even though they were probably opposing at least this sort of essentialist nationalist views as communists and Bolsheviks. And some were just forgotten because, they couldn't be appropriated or absorbed into the nationalist mythology. So part of our efforts as Marxists, actually, and I think that at least like in Kyrgyzstan, there is a group called Kyrgyzsots. It's kind of a very political group in flux, but I'm very appreciative that this is what we as a kind of older generation and them as a slightly younger generation of Marxists share, that we need to constantly appeal and recreate our own Central Asian Marxist and revolutionary tradition.
So let's maybe go back to today and to socialist and the left-wing movement in Central Asia. Are you hopeful? Do you see any political movements being formed? Or do we still have to wait a little bit for the class consciousness to develop?
I don't know if there is a word to describe my sentiment about that. I'm not hopeful, but I'm also not hopeless. So I'm not hopeful because the tendencies that are happening in Central Asia, especially in the places that I know, like any sort of politicization also requires at least some sort of open democratic space. And this space has shrunk, keeps shrinking drastically, even in the places where some pockets of that existed, like in
Bishkek, exactly, yeah.
And that happens on the background of, first, total disintegration of that socialist resilience, the kind of a more expensive privatization of public spaces that provided for that resilience. The class antagonisms become more pronounced. With the simultaneous sort of deprivation of people from the means to understand what is actually happening. Yeah. So that might result not in a revolutionary or radical movements that you and I would be happy about. Yeah, there might be a radical politicization, but it will not necessarily take a twist towards leftist internationalist politics. Most likely, this would be very nationalist, populist, if not fascist movements that would express their dissatisfaction with the state of current affairs. Yeah, we see that. We see these tendencies even among the most liberal, like xenophobia. Yeah, the anti-Chinese sentiments. We also see how very quickly the impulses that are actually class-based are being overtaken by reactionary ideology. That's what we saw in Kazakhstan in 2022, with the Kantar. Because it started as the class movement against the liberal market policies, and it was quickly overtaken by forces of a different political orientation. So no, I'm not hopeful. On the other hand, Central Asia is not an island. Central Asia, as much as Central Asia was integrated into the Soviet realities, it is as much integrated into global capitalism. And, I will give you an example. I think I shared that when we first met in Astana, at the conference, or at a similar conference 10 years ago, it was almost impossible to even utter the word neoliberalism, not to get some, smirks and, side looks from people, because it was anti-intellectual, it was, too Marxist, it was missing the point. That's not the case anymore. There is, even within the academic, there is an understanding that we have ignored for 35 years the development of capitalism and capitalist mode of production in Central Asia. It was intellectually impartial project that discussed things, sort of avoiding the elephant in the room, so to speak, the engine of the processes that were happening. So probably there will be some catch up, and this catch up is also global. There is a global shift, And as I said, Central Asia, as much as it has its own specific, it is very much included into the global processes. So this is where my hope resides, in a way. I do understand that politics has to take local forms, and it will always have local forms. But these local forms are also very much connected with the global developments. So that's how I would describe it. I'm hopeless in a kind of midterm perspective. I put it like that. But I'm a little bit more hopeful in a long-term perspective, depending on how things will develop globally. They would definitely have a refraction in Central Asia as well.
So just to finish, tell me, are there any groups, are there any movements or initiatives in Central Asia that left-wing people could look at to understand what's going on and to maybe track the changes and track what's going on in like left-wing circles?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I don't know if I'm informed enough about that. Definitely, like I might say, I can self-promote a little bit.
Please do.
So my comrades and I would have an initiative that is called Central Asian Marxist Institute, which in Russian stands for Среднеазиатский Марксистский институт, SAMI. So we think of ourselves as some sort of it's a long-term project, which is absolutely self-funded and self-sustainable, doesn't have any external donors, supporters, and therefore no one dictates us what and how we should be doing. We are absolutely self-reliant. We are all intellectuals in some way. Some are institutionalized intellectuals, some are independent intellectuals. We all have a certain activist background. And so we come together to try to understand what is happening with us, with our countries, with our societies, with our world. And we issue a bulletin or like a newsletter once a year, maybe, where we try to sort of do some theoretical or critical work on certain issues, and then we publish it. So I can say about that. I also know that there is a new initiative of a similar kind as a think tank, also kind of international group of people coming from different parts of post-Soviet space and Eastern Europe, but focused specifically on Central Asia, is Superstructure. So connected also to this kind of independent, also self-run media, Red Threads. So maybe, so these two intellectual groups that I'm aware of, of which I'm part of, the Superstructure is connected with Kirk Sots, the group I mentioned in Kyrgyzstan. But also I should mention Books for Development. That's a small independent foundation and a bookstore in Bishkek. And both Anara Maldosheva and Charles Buxton are part of SAMI, but they also have their own independent small initiative, small sort of leftist bookstore in Bishkek. That's another, I think, place to add to the map of leftist initiatives that I am aware of.
Georgy, thank you so much. It was really, really fascinating and interesting to have a different view on my podcast finally. So thank you for that, and all the best to you in your work.
Thank you. It was a very interesting conversation. Looking forward for it to be released.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.